July 22nd, 1967, 11:59 a.m. British summertime. The English Channel, off Folkestone. A salvage diver attached a small explosive cutting charge to the hull of a Polish cargo ship called the SS Kielce, which had sunk in 90 feet of water in 1946 with a cargo of undocumented wartime munitions. The Folkestone Salvage Company had been contracted to clear the wreck as a navigational hazard. They had been removing sections of the hull carefully and methodically for weeks. This was a routine cut, a small charge, a calibrated, controlled, professional procedure. The Kielce detonated. The explosion registered as a 4.5 magnitude earthquake on the Richter scale. It was detected by seismic monitoring stations 5,000 miles away. It blew a crater 153 feet long, 67 feet wide, and 20 feet deep into the Channel seabed. It sent a 500-foot column of water into the air above Folkestone. The atmospheric shockwave tore through the coastal towns, collapsing ceilings, shifting window frames, and producing, in the contemporaneous accounts of people who were standing on the seafront watching the salvage vessel at work, a moment of pure, immediate terror. No one died. The Kielce was 3 to 4 miles offshore, in deeper water, and carried only a fraction of the explosive load of the wreck the UK government has been watching decay in the Thames Estuary for 80 years. The SS Richard Montgomery is 1.5 miles from the town of Sheerness, Kent. It sits in 15 meters of water. It is so shallow that its 3 rusted masts protrude above the surface of the Thames Estuary at every state of the tide, visible from the Sheerness seafront, visible from passing ships, visible from the roads. And inside the forward holds of that wreck sits an estimated 1,400 to 3,105 tons of live high-explosive American munitions, bombs, cluster munitions, white phosphorus devices and demolition charges that the British government has been legally prohibited from disturbing since 1973. The reason it has not been moved is the Kielce. The reason people are asking if that is still good enough is the 2025 survey report, which found that the bridge structure of the SS Richard Montgomery collapsed between its 2024 and 2025 surveys, dropping 1.2 to 1.3 meters in less than 12 months. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. The masts of this ship are visible from the beach. The bombs are visible to nobody. That disparity is the entire story. The SS Richard Montgomery was a Liberty ship laid down at the St. John's River Shipbuilding Company in Jacksonville, Florida, on March 15, 1943, and completed 137 days later, built at the extraordinary pace the wartime emergency demanded, but carrying the structural vulnerabilities that pace produced. Liberty ships were the mass-produced workhorses of the Allied logistics chain, and they were built to a standard that prioritized speed of construction over longevity. The hull was welded rather than riveted, using a grade of steel susceptible to embrittlement and micro-cracking in cold water. They were not built to last. They were built to cross the Atlantic enough times to keep the war supplied. The Richard Montgomery departed Hog Island, Philadelphia, in August 1944, loaded with 6,127 to 7,000 tons of American munitions destined for the Allied forces in France following the Normandy landings. She crossed the Atlantic as part of convoy HX-301, 94 cargo ships and 12 landing ship tanks escorted by 33 warships, and arrived in British waters in mid-August 1944, where she came under the authority of the Thames Naval Control at Southend Pier and was directed to anchor at the Great Nore anchorage off Sheerness while awaiting onward transit to France. The Sheerness harbour master ordered the Montgomery to anchor at a berth on the northern edge of Sheerness Middle Sand, where the depth of water at low tide was 24 feet. The ship's draft was 31 feet. The assistant harbour master explicitly objected, requesting that the Montgomery exchange berths with a shallower drafted vessel safely anchored in deeper water nearby. He was overruled. In a force 8 gale on August 20, 1944, the ship dragged her anchor, drifted onto the sandbank, and grounded amidships. What happened next? The salvage attempt, the structural failure, the abandonment, has been covered in detail in earlier Naval Report episodes. The short version is this. Salvage crews successfully removed approximately half the cargo from the aft holds, but the process of lightening the stern while the midship remained pinned on the sandbank applied torsional stress the Liberty ship's welded hull could not withstand. The hull broke. The forward section, containing the majority of the heavy ordnance, flooded. The salvage was abandoned on September 25, 1944. Everything in holds 1, 2, and 3 stayed where it was. What remained is documented in the 2000 survey conducted by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency and assessed by the Defense Evaluation and Research Agency. 286 2,000-pound high-explosive general-purpose bombs, 4,439 1,000-pound bombs, 1,925 500-pound bombs, 521 to 580 individual fragmentation bombs, and 2,297 cases of fragmentation cluster munitions, white phosphorus smoke bombs, explosive booster charges, pyrotechnic signals. The net explosive quantity, the actual weight of explosive compound, excluding steel casing and packaging, is officially cited at approximately 1,400 tons. Independent analysts working from the original cargo manifests and salvage logs argue that because the salvage operation prioritized lighter, more accessible munitions from the aft holds, the heavy ordnance left behind amounts to considerably more, closer to 3,105 tons gross weight, or by some calculations more than double the official figure. The discrepancy turns on whether you are measuring net explosive quantity or total cargo weight. Both figures describe the same bombs. Both figures represent one of the largest concentrations of live wartime ordnance anywhere in the world. The most common question asked about the SS Richard Montgomery is why, after 80 years underwater, anyone still considers it dangerous. The intuitive assumption is that explosives corrode, that seawater degrades everything, that a bomb submerged for 8 decades must by now be inert. This intuition is wrong in specific ways that the chemistry makes clear. The primary explosive fill in the Montgomery's cargo is TNT, trinitrotoluene, and a mixture called amatol, combining ammonium nitrate with TNT. TNT is one of the most chemically stable explosive compounds known. It does not react with water. It does not lose its explosive capability through immersion. The DRA assessment specifically concluded that the TNT aboard the Montgomery remains capable of a mass, high-order detonation. The years have not rendered it safe, the years have preserved it. As TNT slowly degrades at the molecular margins, it forms compounds called 2-ADNT and 4-ADNT, marine toxicants of extreme potency, representing a slow ecological release alongside the physical blast risk. The debate about the fuses is more genuinely contested. The fusing mechanisms of the fragmentation bombs contain lead azide as a primary explosive initiator. Under certain conditions, lead azide can react with water vapor to form hydrozoic acid, which then reacts with copper components in the fuse to produce copper azide, extraordinarily sensitive to friction, to mechanical shock, to minimal disturbance. If copper azide has formed in the fuses of the Montgomery's cluster munitions, then almost any physical disturbance could initiate a detonation propagating through the entire primary payload. The government's counter is that the fuses have been flooded with liquid seawater for decades, not water vapor, and that liquid water dissolves lead azide rather than facilitating the copper azide reaction. The U.S. Naval Sea Systems Command has found synthesized copper azide surprisingly resistant to mechanical shock testing. The firing pins within the fragmentation bombs are likely corroded solid. The honest scientific answer is that both positions are partially credible and cannot be definitively resolved without directly examining the cargo, which requires disturbing the cargo, which is the one thing the Kielce demonstrated you must never do. What is not in dispute is the structural threat. Positioned on the tween deck, the intermediate deck directly above the main TNT payload, are approximately 175 tons of fully fused fragmentation cluster bombs. The 2024 and 2025 surveys confirm that the deck plating beneath them is actively caving in. If the deck fails, those armed cluster bombs fall directly onto the TNT below. This is not theoretical. It is already beginning. The SS Kielce sank in the English Channel off Folkestone in 1946 after a collision with another vessel carrying an undocumented cargo of wartime munitions. She lay in 90 feet of water, 3 to 4 miles offshore, for 2 decades while navigational concerns accumulated. In 1967, the Folkestone Salvage Company was contracted to clear the wreck. Their methodology involved a series of small explosive cutting charges to sever sections of the hull. The first several cuts were conducted without incident. On July 22, 1967, the third or fourth charge, a small, professional, calibrated charge applied by experienced salvage divers, initiated a sympathetic detonation of the Kielce's primary cargo. The seismic event registered on instruments 5,000 miles away. The crater it excavated in the Channel seabed measured 153 feet long, 67 feet wide, and 20 feet deep. The atmospheric shockwave caused structural damage in Folkestone and Hythe, collapsing ceilings and shifting window frames. Nobody was killed, primarily because the Kielce was in deeper water and further from shore than the Montgomery, and carried only a small fraction of the Montgomery's explosive load. The lesson the British government drew from Kielce was specific and consequential. Decayed wartime munitions are not less dangerous than fresh ones. They may be more dangerous. The corrosion products of aging explosives and fuse chemistry can produce compounds more sensitive than the original materials. Water, instead of neutralizing the cargo, may act as a medium for chemical transformation that increases sensitivity to mechanical shock. The pressure and density of the marine environment amplify and direct explosive force rather than absorbing it. And the one thing that had appeared to be a small, controlled, professional intervention, a single cutting charge applied by experienced divers, had produced the largest non-nuclear explosion on the English seabed since the Second World War. The British government's response to Kielce was to codify non-intervention as official policy. In 1973, the Protection of Wrecks Act designated the SS Richard Montgomery the first dangerous wreck in UK law, establishing a legal exclusion zone and forbidding any approach to the site without explicit governmental authorization. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency was tasked with maintaining warning buoys, radar surveillance, and annual monitoring surveys. The strategy was explicit: observe the deterioration, hope the sea gradually renders the explosives inert, and never disturb the cargo. For 50 years, this was the policy. The 2024 and 2025 surveys have made it considerably harder to defend. If you have stayed with this story to here, if the specific combination of what the Kielce proved and what the 2025 survey found is landing, comment Montgomery below and subscribe to Naval Report if you haven't already. The data from the most recent surveys changes the calculation in ways the government has not yet fully publicly acknowledged. The MCA has been conducting annual surveys of the SS Richard Montgomery since the 1990s, transitioning from MOD diver inspections to high-resolution multi-beam echo sounder technology, as visibility conditions in the wreck made human inspection impractical. The accumulated dataset now covers 3 decades of structural observation, and it describes a vessel in progressive, accelerating collapse. The 2008 and 2009 surveys identified accelerated buckling on the starboard hull and a crack at hold 2 that widened by 50 centimeters in a single year, a rate that alarmed the engineers who reviewed it and produced language in the survey summaries, suggesting that while significant structural collapse was not immediately imminent, the trend was clearly moving in that direction. By 2024, the LiDAR surveys were detecting a significant drop in the tween deck at the aft end of hold 2, the exact deck supporting the 175 tons of fragmentation cluster bombs, and the bridge area was described as actively collapsing. The 2025 survey quantified the scale of the ongoing structural failure. The forward section of the wreck tilted an additional 2 meters eastward between the 2023 and 2025 surveys. The bridge structure itself, the most visible above-water feature of the wreck after the masts, dropped 1.2 to 1.3 meters in the interval between the 2024 and 2025 surveys. It did not decline gradually. It dropped suddenly in a structural failure that moved the deck into the gap between the 2 halves of the broken vessel and dragged surrounding deck equipment with it. The scour pit at the stern deepened by 0.8 meters in a single year, leaving the rudder and propeller suspended and fully exposed to the tidal currents that continue to excavate the seabed beneath the vessel. The wreck lies across the tidal flow, and the tides are removing the material that supports it at a rate the surveys can now measure annually. The specific failure the engineers have been warning about for 15 years, the tween deck giving way under the weight of the cluster munitions and dropping them onto the TNT below, is not a future risk in the 2025 survey. It is an ongoing process. The deck is moving, the cargo is moving with it. The question is whether the movement is producing the kind of mechanical shock event that the fuse chemistry might respond to. The government's official position is that the wreck remains stable if undisturbed, a phrase that appears in multiple survey summaries and functions as the foundation of the non-intervention doctrine. The 2025 survey stretches the definition of undisturbed considerably, since the bridge structure just moved 1.3 meters without anyone touching it. The direct blast consequences of a mass detonation of the SS Richard Montgomery's cargo are well modeled and frequently cited. A 1970 BBC-commissioned analysis projected a 300-meter wide column of debris and water reaching 3,000 meters altitude, with a localized tsunami of up to 5 meters. More recent hydrodynamic modeling by Ministry of Defense researchers and independent geotechnical firms has revised this figure downward to a wave of 1 to 1.5 meters, still sufficient to breach coastal defenses and cause severe flooding across low-lying areas of Kent and Essex, and to scatter high-velocity steel shrapnel from the bomb casings across the shoreline at Sheerness, 1.5 miles away. These direct effects are catastrophic enough. The secondary scenario is considerably worse. Less than 2,000 meters from the Montgomery, on the Isle of Grain, sits the National Grid's liquefied natural gas terminal, the largest LNG importation and storage facility in Europe, with a storage capacity exceeding 1 million cubic meters. The terminal supplies a substantial proportion of the United Kingdom's natural gas during peak winter demand periods. It is a piece of critical national infrastructure whose disruption would have immediate cascading effects on domestic heating and industrial power supply. If the Montgomery's cargo detonated, the shockwave and the high-velocity steel fragments projected from the hull and bomb casings at supersonic speeds would reach the Isle of Grain within seconds. LNG storage silos are engineered to significant specifications, and the industry maintains they are resilient to external impacts. The question that independent explosive analysts have repeatedly raised, without a fully satisfying official answer, is whether they are engineered to resist the specific combination of a 1.4 kiloton underwater explosion at under 2 kilometers range, plus a simultaneous barrage of high-velocity steel shrapnel from thousands of bomb casings. A breach of the LNG silos would release methane in quantities sufficient to form a fuel-air mixture over a substantial area. If that mixture found an ignition source, the superheated blast wave itself, or the white phosphorus devices in the Montgomery's cargo, which ignite spontaneously on contact with atmospheric oxygen, the resulting fuel-air explosion would dwarf the initial shipwreck detonation by multiple orders of magnitude. Independent analysts have described this combined scenario, at the extreme end of their modeling, as potentially equivalent to 160 Hiroshima-scale events. A figure so large it requires caveat after caveat about modeling assumptions, but which reflects the real and documented concern that the risk from the Montgomery is not merely the wreck itself, but the wreck in the context of what surrounds it. What is undisputed is that no serious risk assessment of the SS Richard Montgomery considers only the direct blast effects. The LNG terminal is in every significant consequence model because it is within the projection radius of the explosion that every model produces. The government's strict non-intervention doctrine began to shift in 2021 when the Department for Transport officially reversed its absolute position and announced plans to sever and remove the 3 masts. The engineering case for removing the masts is straightforward. They function as giant lever arms. Buffeted by tidal currents and storm winds, they transfer enormous torsional stress directly down through the mast foundations into the already cracked deck plating surrounding the forward holds. As the deck continues to corrode and flex, a severe storm could snap the masts at their bases, sending hundreds of tons of steel rigging crashing directly into the forward cargo area. This is the failure scenario the engineers describe as most immediately likely to trigger a detonation. Not the slow chemical transformation of fuse compounds, not the gradual flooding of the holds, but the sudden massive mechanical shock of mast collapse onto armed ordnance. Removing the masts eliminates this risk. It does nothing about the cargo. The mast removal project was scheduled for summer 2022. It was delayed to 2023 when preparatory surveys identified obstacles requiring additional assessment. It was delayed again in 2023 when high-resolution sonar scans of the seabed surrounding the wreck detected 18 unidentified metallic objects in the mud around the hull. These objects were assessed as unexploded ordnance, bombs that had over the decades tumbled from the rupturing hull into the soft sediment surrounding the wreck where they had been resting, unfused or partially corroded within the exclusion zone. The original mast removal plan had involved anchoring a heavy jack-up barge directly beside the wreck, driving steel legs into the seabed to create a stable working platform from which the cutting equipment could operate. With 18 unidentified explosive objects in the seabed exactly where the barge legs would be planted, that plan became untenable. The risk of a barge leg crushing a submerged bomb and triggering a sympathetic detonation of the entire cargo made the cure demonstrably worse than the disease. The plan was completely redesigned. After an extended period of advanced engineering assessment, including a no-fly zone implemented by the Civil Aviation Authority in May 2025 over a 1 nautical mile radius around the wreck at altitudes below 13,100 feet, covering both aircraft and drones in recognition of the site's security vulnerability, the Department for Transport moved forward with a new contracting process under the Procurement Act 2023. In 2026, following a competitive flexible procedure managed with legal support from DWF Group, the DFT awarded a £9.5 million contract to Resolve Marine, an American maritime salvage firm with an extensive portfolio of complex hazardous wreck operations. Resolve Marine's methodology avoids seabed stabilization entirely, using floating gantries positioned above the waterline to sever the masts using cutting techniques that generate zero vibration in the hull below. The operation is scheduled to begin and complete before 2027, weather and sea state permitting. A minor but revealing diplomatic development accompanied the contract announcement. Under international maritime law, the SS Richard Montgomery is the sovereign property of the United States government, an American ship registered in America, owned by an American shipping company whose obligations transferred to the US government after the war. Any artifact removed from the wreck technically reverts to US ownership. Negotiations between the UK Department for Transport and US maritime authorities, championed partly by local MP Kevin McKenna, resulted in the United States officially agreeing to allow the UK to retain the severed masts for potential heritage display in museums at Sheerness and Southend. The masts of a ship full of live bombs have been standing in the Thames Estuary for 80 years. They are coming down. The bombs are staying. The mast removal operation, for all its engineering complexity, is a response to the most immediately accessible risk, the mechanical hazard of mast collapse, without addressing the fundamental question of the cargo. When the masts have been cleanly severed and the 2027 deadline has passed, 1,400 to 3,105 tons of live American ordnance will still be in the forward holds of a ship whose bridge structure just dropped 1.3 meters and whose deck is actively caving in above its most volatile contents. Why does the cargo stay? The Kielce answers the question, but the specific physics are worth spelling out. Any intervention that physically accesses the cargo, divers removing bombs by hand, cranes lifting ordnance section by section, cofferdams built around the wreck to dewater the holds for aerial access, requires human beings or heavy machinery to directly handle armed munitions that have been deteriorating for 8 decades in conditions that may or may not have increased their sensitivity to mechanical shock. The DRA assessment says the fuse leader side has dissolved and the bombs are not especially sensitive to shock. The independent critics say the fused cluster munitions on the tween deck are the most immediately dangerous items in any scenario involving mechanical disturbance. Both positions agree that there is genuine, unquantifiable uncertainty about what physical contact with this specific cargo in its current condition would produce. The Kielce demonstrated what the lower end of that uncertainty looks like. A small cutting charge at the far end of the operational radius, in deeper water, further from shore, carrying far less explosive. A 4.5 Richter seismic event, a crater in the seabed, a shockwave through the coastal towns. No one died specifically because the Kielce was not the Montgomery. The calculation the British government has made for 50 years and continues to make is that the risk of triggering the detonation during an intervention attempt is greater than the risk of allowing the wreck to deteriorate naturally toward a state where the explosives are inert. The first risk is immediate, acute, and would be the direct result of governmental action. The government would have caused the explosion. The second risk is slow, probabilistic, and might resolve in the government's favor if the sea does its work quickly enough. The 2024 and 2025 surveys suggest the second risk is less probabilistic and less slow than the policy has assumed. The bridge just moved 1.3 meters. The tween deck is already caving in. The eastward tilt of the forward section increased by 2 meters in 2 years. The scour pit is deepening. The stable if undisturbed language in the survey summaries sits uncomfortably alongside data describing a wreck in rapid, ongoing structural collapse. What the government cannot do is make this problem disappear. The cargo will be there after the masts are removed. It will be there while the surveys continue. It will be there in 2030 and 2040 and beyond, unless either the sea renders it inert, an engineered extraction becomes feasible at acceptable risk, or something else happens first: a mast collapse, a ship collision, a structural failure of the tween deck, a sabotage event, a storm strong enough to shift the fractured hull sections against each other. In October 2025, a Kremlin-aligned Russian academic named Andrei Sidorov appeared on Russian state television and said of the Montgomery, "There are 1,400 tons of explosives there. If you hit it, this will flood all the coastal villages and ports." He added, "Just don't accuse me of terrorism." This broadcast has been noted in UK security assessments of the site, and it is one of the specific reasons the May 2025 no-fly zone covered drones as well as aircraft. The masts are being removed partly because they are structural liabilities. They are also being removed because they are visible, precisely located landmarks that a commercial drone could navigate toward from international waters using publicly available maritime charts. The masts will go. The bombs will stay. The surveys will continue. The ship will keep tilting. 3 rusted masts in the Thames Estuary. A ship underneath them that has been slowly breaking for 80 years. A government that cannot move the cargo without risking triggering the explosion they are trying to prevent. The watches have been kept since 1944. Whether they will be enough depends on whether the sea finishes the job before the ship decides to finish it itself. If this story reached you, subscribe to Naval Report. The wreck is still there. The masts are coming down. The bombs are not going anywhere.